Sustainable Development and Transformative Learning, which is based on a chapter in this book that Carson mentioned, which just appeared. Actually, this is a kind of pre-copy that the editors got, but I highly recommend it to you, of course. This is a talking about innovation, following Jan Peter's classification, which also was Andy's, more or less. Well, it's the same, and I really do follow on that in a somewhat different way, but really pursuing the same goal. I'm talking more about learning, more specifically about learning, reflexive learning. Learning is by all measures a central social concept. It's the very thing that makes us human. The possibility to learn gives us the chance to constructively change our personal and social worlds. Moreover, learning is now a salient concept, theoretical and practical in the policy sciences and in the theory of governance. Actually, you could say the governance term is in every way implicitly and explicitly about learning, social learning, learning about innovation. Indeed, so dominant is the emphasis on social learning that some fear that it's become an ideology. One can hear about the importance of learning from the United Nations, but also from British Petroleum. So the effort here is to both understand how learning is being used and, from a different perspective, how it might be used in a more critical way. Given that sustainable development is about transition, transformation, it comes as no surprise that learning for transformation is central to its theory and practices. From the Earth's Summit in Rio forward, learning has been stressed as an important element of sustainable development or sustainable governance. Our Common Future devotes a chapter to it, and in the supporting document, Agenda 21, the word education appears only less frequently than the word governance. But throughout education and learning are discussed in a very conventional language, kind of the language almost of a school brochure, which has led others to put forward a more critical document called the Earth Charter, warning against an instrumental, more technocratic understanding of sustainable development. The language of the Earth Charter, in comparison, offers a bold educational reformulation that relates learning to our cultural relationship to nature, interconnections between environmental and socioeconomic problems, and the long-term governance of our relation to the planet. So understood, the goal of sustainability learning is to facilitate, reflexively, a radical cultural shift that brings society back in line with the Earth's carrying capacity. At the 2002 World Summit for Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, it was hoped that the UN would adopt the Earth Charter, but despite active support from prominent figures like Maurice Strong and Mikhail Gorbachev, it was rejected. Nonetheless, the UN announced the Decade of Education for Sustainable Development in 2005, which is then still going on, in case you didn't notice. The campaign promotes learning for sustainable development as a crucial field to be integrated across the disciplines and at all levels of education. Education, including education for policy and planning. There has, in fact, been a growth of such programs, although such learning still largely remains on the margins of the curricula. Most of these programs are highly influenced by a scientific worldview, generally advancing a dichotomous view of nature and humankind implicitly or explicitly, which Andy was, in a different way, making clear. Neglected is a diverse multi-perspectival ecological politics that includes principles of environmental justice across categories of difference, race, class, gender, species, and so on, leading some critics to describe such curricula as greenwash. There is thus a need to reflexively reconstruct our understanding of social learning for the governance of sustainability. Elsewhere, I've focused on programs, educational programs generally. Here, I will focus on education and learning in the disciplines of policy and planning. This is especially important given the role generally assigned to these disciplines, or they assign to themselves, in environmental discourse, namely a fundamental role in the governance processes of a sustainable transition. Ecological transformation of modern society as such involves modes of governmental steering, and these disciplines have concerned themselves with innovating new practices of enlightened governance, the focus of many of us here in this room. And toward this end, the concept of social learning has taken an important place in the literature of both disciplines. But the work in these disciplines has largely focused on the technical dimensions of policy learning, neglecting a deeper attention to policy paradigms, that is, systems of governance of which they are a part. Since sustainable development requires a reflexive examination of the assumptions informing a progressive action orientation, as Andy made clear, we need to think of this, we need to rethink this understanding of learning. The concept of learning, understood as a change in thinking, perception, and attitude, becomes especially important in policy analysis and planning, given the ever-growing number of crisis-ridden governance problems in need of innovative solutions, including the environmental crisis. We need to thus explore the ways in which the assumptions, beliefs, and implications of policy paradigms, such as sustainable development, can be reflexively integrated into the discursive work, both public and professional, of the environmental planner, policy analyst, and the practitioners of governance. In policy studies, learning is generally dated to the work of Hugh Heclo. Attention to learning, in his view, leads to better explanations of policy outcomes than the theories based solely on social and economic variables. When we focus on learning in the policy process, according to Heclo, politics finds its sources not only in power, but also in uncertainty, as he puts it, men collectively wondering what to do. He conceptualized the process as a form of collective puzzlement on society's behalf, entailing not only knowing and deciding, but also learning. Sabatier brings this perspective to environmental policy. The central feature of his influential advocacy coalition framework turns on the ways in which members of different policy coalitions, organized around competing environmental beliefs, how they can learn from policy research and debates in policy communities. This orientation stresses the role of policy ideas and analysis in the policy process and emphasizes empirical explanation of learning in environmental policy change. However, this work, despite its recognition of ideas, focuses on the more technical aspects of debate and assumes that changes in more fundamental beliefs related to governments are atypical. Thus, these scholars tend to examine instrumental learning based on technical information. The approach is narrow and tends to be technocratic. Peter Hall, by contrast, has identified the more fundamental importance of what he calls paradigmatic change. He defines social learning as an attempt, a deliberate attempt to adjust the goals or techniques of policy in response to past experience and new information, with learning occurring when policy changes as a result of such a process. While he recognizes the technical dimensions of policy deliberation, Hall goes beyond setting technical levels of policy instruments, for example, the degrees of permissible air pollution, and the changing of policy instruments, for example, carbon trading or carbon taxes. That is, he extends learning to include changes in the policy paradigm defined as the framework of ideas and standards that specifies not only the goals of policy and the kinds of instruments used to obtain them, but also the very nature of the problems to be addressed. Hall's work acknowledges that change in policy paradigms, such as sustainable development, does not happen regularly, but when it does happen, such changes, the result of new learning, are of crucial importance for governance. Yeah, I was going to ask you, thank you. While policy researchers have sought an empirical explanation of learning in the institutional structures of policy processes, planners have tended to focus more normatively on the role of agency, including the facilitation of learning, the result of the action-oriented nature of planning. Rather than focusing on empirical theory as such, the applied assignment of the planner is to develop courses of action based on relevant knowledge. John Friedman has conceptualized planning itself as social learning, explaining that the principal focus of the social learning approach is on action. And as such, it mainly manifests itself as a change in practical activity, and thus it is rarely systematized or articulated in the formal language of scientific discourse. Instead, social learning involves a more informal, discursive process facilitated by change agents who encourage, guide, and assist actors in the process of changing social reality. Such agents serve as facilitators who bring certain kinds of formal knowledge to ongoing social practices, the practices of their client group. They do this by developing his words, transactional relationship with the clients conducive to mutual learning. Such learning is typically carried out in small groups, whether in the planning office or in civil society. Important here are the ways we learn through dialogic action to probe and test our assumptions, particularly as they relate to the proposals for action. In this understanding, knowledge is ultimately validated when it helps to settle or dispose of a problem in a particular context. But this validation does not rest on a narrow empirical understanding of either the problem or the test. Rather, it is the result of a dialectical interaction between theoretical perspectives and everyday practices that probe the underlying assumptions that structure the perceptions of the social problems. Here, Friedman recognizes the need to get at the deeper, often tacit assumptions that underlie and frequently plague decision-making. Similar to Hall's emphasis on the underlying policy paradigm, Friedman's is a call for planners to assist citizens and clients in identifying and assessing the deeper interpretive frameworks that more fundamentally shape their immediate problems. An important additional step is found in the work of Donald Schurn, focused on the need for learning in the face of growing uncertainty confronting contemporary societies. For Schurn, the loss of the stable state for decision makers, institutions, and larger systems of governance requires planners and policy analysis to learn about learning. It becomes essential to learn about the conditions of complexity, uncertainty, and instability as they pertain to planned social change. Schoen attributed the failure of expertise in planning and policy analysis to an outdated adherence to the technical mode of rationality and the superior subordinate relationship between the expert and clients that it demands. He thus called for open and authentic interactions between experts and clients in planning and policy science. They were the key to the reconstruction of expert practices. As an alternative to the technical approach to problem solving, he advanced the non-technical interpretive practice of what he called problem setting, based on a conversation with the situation. Engaging Schoen's approach, John Forrester draws out its transformative dimensions and their implications. Arguing for a move beyond the standard understanding of dialogue to the processes of transformative learning, Forrester explores the ways that learning occurs not just through arguments, not just through the framing of ideas, not just through the critique of expert knowledge, but through transformations of the relationships and responsibilities of networks and competence of collective memory and memberships. He asserts that many analyses of dialogue and democratic argument do not go far enough to do justice to the learning that dialogical and argumentative processes can promote. The standard approach to deliberation and empowerment tends to reduce these processes to a matter of being heard. Learning is thus reduced to knowing information, and deliberation is treated as merely speaking, and in the process, the transformation of passive citizens into active participants tends to get lost. Thus, much more is at stake in the dialogic processes than the claim about what is true. Also involved are questions of political membership and identity, memory and hope, confidence and competence, appreciation and respect, acknowledgement, and the ability to act together. The transformations at stake are those not only of knowledge, or class structure, but of people more or less able to act practically together to better their lives, or as Forrester concludes, people we might call citizens. While writers such as Schoen and Forrester make clear the need to include basic policy beliefs as paradigms and their assumptions in practical deliberation, the epistemology of this process has received far less attention, as Andy makes clear. An approach is needed that recognizes the technical component of planning and policy analysis, but also seeks to critique and reconstruct the technocratic process that has often wittingly or unwittingly emerged. Thus, understanding thus depends on the interpretation of a multiplicity of uncertain events through dialogic deliberation with a wider set of participants. From this perspective, policies for sustainability must be understood as social constructs. They are discursively created socio-political agreements that set out courses of action that rest on understandings based on normative and empirical beliefs. Environmental policy, in this view, is a discursive struggle over the interpretation of assumptions that shape policy definitions, the boundaries of the categories used to explicate them, the evaluative criteria for their assessments, and the social and political meanings of the ideals that guide their particular actions. Thus, policies and plans can always be seen as doing two things at once. They attempt to effectively solve a problem, and at the same time, they seek to do it in ways that reproduce the norms and values of particular governing arrangements and the politics supporting them. The task of the analyst must include helping the client learn about and understand the multiple understandings of what otherwise appears to be a single concept. It involves uncovering the hidden assumptions embedded in a policy concept that can illuminate and even at times resolve conflicts at hand. Along with my colleague Alan Mandel, we have extended this constructivist perspective and its emphasis on social and political assumptions by turning to the work on transformative learning found in the progressive educational literature, educational theory, particularly concerned with adult learning. A deeper form of learning, a form of Schoen's reflection in action, transformative learning takes on special importance today as the issues facing contemporary societies have gradually, and sometimes not so gradually, moved from incremental problems to matters of crisis that raise profound questions about the very nature of the societal governance of which they're a part. Urgent questions such as climate change, the collapse of the international financial system, international terrorism, and pandemic medical emergencies all indicate that the very assumptions that inform our thinking about the governance of these issues are the root of the problem. The goal of this transformative perspective is thus to develop a more participatory, discursive relationship between practitioners and those they seek to advise, a diverse set of decision makers, clients, and citizens. Transformative learning begins with the understanding that transformation does not come easily. In fact, mostly it recognizes that it's triggered by some crisis, personal or societal, that starts people thinking in this way. A term that is often bantered around too casually, transformative learning rejects the simple versions of the relationship of learning to action. First, the policy analytic view that there's a relatively direct impact on learning, impact of learning on decision making, as well as the more romantic notion of the environmental left that critical ecological consciousness will lead people to take action. The eco-pedagogical work in this tradition begins with the recognition that sustainability has to become the organizing concept of modern society, not just one topic among others. Further, the standard approach proceeds from the established social and cultural understandings, where the standard approach proceeds from established social and cultural understandings. Transformative learning is geared to social meaning and meaning making. It begins with the realization that learners bring with them deeply ingrained cognitive predispositions, tacit understandings, emotional commitments, and worldviews. Rooted in preferred conceptions of society and their social values, these worldviews determine which facts are taken seriously or even what's considered to be a fact. Indeed, research shows that people hang on to these preferred ideologies long after basic empirical realities show that no longer justify them, even in the throes of impending crisis, as we see in climate change debates, at least in my own country. Transformative learning thus recognizes that these frozen ideational frameworks and their fixed social meanings have to be softened up through a deliberative process of problematization before learning can lead to critical awareness and changed behavior. I could say a word, I'm going to skip this, but often this kind of work, when it's in the educational setting or even organizational setting, there's a lot of organizational work that's used transformative learning, starts out by having people take a walk in the woods, think about where their blue jeans came from, maybe visit an eco-village or something like this to actually loosen up their relationship to themselves and what's going on around them. This transformative journey seeks to foster a sense of connectedness through integrative knowledge across generations and between humans and other members of the biotic community. Instead of a rational process analyze, think, change, the emphasis shifts to affective knowledge, see, feel, change, in which awareness of feelings and emotions are interdependent with cognition, which is seen to increase the likelihood of change. The teacher-facilitator asks learners to experientially submit their socially established meanings of concepts such as nature, work, consumption, transportation, and leisure to critical inspection. Once these assumptions have been opened for exploration by the learners themselves, transformative learning pursues a three-phased practical discourse, the first stage of which is a narrative dialogue that involves telling a story about a problem or event. The story affirms or reaffirms a subjective and objective reality, for example, liberal capitalism in the course of material progress, the meaning of which is otherwise seems self-evident in the modern ongoing social world, making this social construction of reality seem true and normal in everyday life. As the settled meanings of the issue become unsettled, for example, an apple comes to be seen as poisonous, intellectual and emotional apprehensiveness leads to a second phase. In the second phase, a threatening situation has to be confronted. The deliberative praxis is to make apparent the narrative contradictions related to anxiety-producing dilemmas, for example, the dangers of the risk society. This involves a transactional conversation about the evidence, arguments, and meanings concerning health risks. In the third phase, citizens and learners explore the meaningful relationships between the problematic relationship, cancer-causing pesticides, and similar themes and experiences related to other places and other possibilities. In the process, learners come to perceive these problems and conflicts in the context of the larger societal frameworks which give them meaning, helping to develop their reflective capacities from alternative perspectives. This holds out the possibility of a revised narrative dialogic process through which the dilemma comes to make sense, with the goal of developing a new story, for example, sustainable development and local organic food production, that better interprets the problem, what it means, how it came about, and what to do about it. The multidimensionality of this process requires the practitioner to be knowledgeable and fluent in various modes of environmental communication, from risk assessment and storytelling to interpretive meanings of visual and body language. In the course of such interactions, he or she has to attend to the educational levels, social understandings, and environmental experiences of the participants, and as well the power dynamics that shape the situation. A transformative interaction as such involves a complex interpersonal dialogue in which the personalities of the individuals involved, the emotional dispositions of the context, and the prevailing political climate affect the nature and form of learning. The task is to present the eco-critique of the political economic order in ways that helps to develop action strategies oriented to the uncertainties and complexities that shape both the situational context and the larger social world of which it's a part. Here we confront another dimension of the change that is either ignored or too implicit in much of environmental learning, that is, an exploration of the social space between ecological knowledge on the one hand and political action and governance on the other. We have to better theorize the everyday cognitive realm that mediates between knowledge and action. We might start by identifying this as a form of pragmatic action rationality that links knowledge and substantive decisions. Transformative learning approaches this space by assisting learners to problematize the social structures and meanings in their everyday realities, what the phenomenologist calls the logic of the situation, in an effort to connect their own realities to a problem and a course of action. This conversation with the situation, as Schern called it, represents an effort to identify and sort out the tensions that need to be examined, as well as to locate openings that might be able to connect with other situated narratives. It seeks, as such, to help learners come to grip with the situational logic that governs the possible choices of action and what they would mean for different groups. Moving away from the we're all in one boat perspective, common to sustainable development, it is crucial to convey the ways that people's understandings of the environment are highly influenced by their own identities and place-oriented experiences. That is, how they mean different things in different cultures and even subcultures. This involves a practical rather than a theoretical assessment of both the micro and macro interconnections of the ecological choices in terms of their consequences for particular communities, available evidence, knowledge of political strategies, understandings about the barriers to change, and existing political resources. Breakthroughs are understood to only come when people arrive at these insights by themselves, through their own vocabularies, in the light of their own interests and concerns. It is the participants themselves who must actually decide which courses of action they are willing to take or not as they bear the consequences. I have a great Habermas quote on that, but I'm going to leave that for later. Okay, action rationality. Exploring the connection between knowledge and action brings us back to an old but still relevant theoretical debate in social and political theory about radical change. That is, the conflict between systemic and incremental change. Indeed, it is a debate that environmental struggles bring back to the forefront. Piecemeal measures, as we know, can scarcely resolve problems that have reached a global catastrophic dimension, as they don't get at the roots of the problem. On the other hand, if there is no possibility of bringing about radical transformational change, we are left only to wait until the catastrophe wreaks its havoc. We thus find ourselves stuck between two options, neither of which works, at least alone. From the point of view of citizen learning, people can become more informed about the dynamics of ecological crisis, but the information tends to simply be overwhelming. The kind of basic changes that are required are often beyond imagination and therefore all too frequently lead to either a form of fatalism or denial. Thus, nothing happens, at least until the coming crisis hits all of us down the road with full force. An alternative, then, is to take up the question, how can action be reoriented as to relate ecological transformation to a particular form of incrementalism that people are able to grasp and act, and upon which they can act. The task, as my colleague Mandel and I have formulated, is to begin with place, the place of the learner and citizen, and look for things that can be done, in large part through small changes. But deliberation cannot stop here. The goal is to have the learners look for ways to connect the problems at hand and the reforms that have been proposed or carried out to the larger systemic dimensions of the crisis or dilemma. Here we appealed to what Andre Gortz called structural reforms. Rather than just any reforms, these incremental reforms these are incremental reforms that hold out the possibility of further movement in the direction of the larger questions. Attention to the larger systems dimensions should not push us away from the particulars and responses to them To focus on the particulars should not lead us to neglect the larger context in which the particulars exist. As a simple example, the environmental movement's effort to support NIMBY, not in my backyard, but to do it in a way that facilitates what's been called NIAMBY, not in anybody's backyard, could be an example. Incremental thinking should also not close off the possibility of larger and larger incremental changes. Moreover, starting with incremental changes can increase motivation and participation, and thus potentially will increase the rate of change. This can facilitate the efforts of the transformative practitioner to interest people in looking for the deeper causes of the problems they confront and trying to make sense of them. How am I doing?
Very good. If you want up to 10 more minutes.
Finally, social learning does not guarantee that societal transformation will occur. It is a concern that continues to vex environmentalists in general. How can citizens learn about the gravity of our environmental crisis but not be moved to take concerted action? We need to confront here the fact that environmental learning runs up against deeply entrenched attitudes and values, lodged in institutions, powerful enough to override alternative perspectives. Indeed, as Martin Heyer has shown, the environmental movement can even win the ecological discourse, but there still will be no policy change unless these changes are made in the institutional discourses and practices of the governance system. As long-standing debates in planning have made clear, societal institutions are seldom able to change in an anticipatory fashion based on societal learning. You can go far back in the history looking for examples where a society simply learned something and decided they would change in anticipation in a simple way. Typically, such institutions have to confront a major systemic shock, a crisis, before they can learn transformatively. It's a point that's also confirmed by the theory of transformative learning. In such crises, the major societal organizing principles become problematic, just what we confront today as we attempt to shift from the problematic organizing principles of a techno-capitalist system to those of sustainable development. In the face of crisis, however, there is no necessary transformative reaction. There can be any number of possible reactions to a crisis, some of which only perpetuate the system already in place. The direction and degree of social learning depends on what happens after the crisis. Critical here are the communicative transactions that emerge to define and interpret the crisis. What follows the crisis depends discursively on the rhetorical skills and persuasiveness of the dominant elites whose legitimation and leadership are needed, at least in the system society that we live in. Given that there are major winners and losers in the process, the relative power and influence of interest groups offering interpretations will be a major determinant of public learning. At many or most points in the environmental struggles, corporate power, as we regularly observe, will trump over better ecological arguments. What is more, the political conditions for systemic transformation are not currently at hand. While environmental problems are on the agenda at all levels of governance, they are, sadly, not the dominant priority. Though this can be difficult for environmentalists to grasp, there is no immediate crisis in the public mind, especially since the financial crisis of 2008. To be sure, there are disasters like Fukushima, but they don't happen everywhere or every day. And more than a few will argue that we can learn from these tragedies and thus continue to rely on nuclear power. The counter-argument, which shows that social learning does not specify a particular content. Your learning may not be my learning. There are political and economic elites who recognize the importance of ecological issues, but most of them push for a weaker form of ecological modernization. And disturbingly, there are the climate deniers who argue that the crisis is an exaggeration, if not manufactured. The leading climate change denial organization, the Heartland Institution, is even, according to the New York Times, preparing a curriculum for environmental learning for the schools. Such transformation is thus not just a matter of political leaders and the public learning the ecological parameters of the crisis, period. While such knowledge remains important, it is not the central factor that will trigger ecological transformation. It is better to think of social learning as a necessary but not a sufficient condition. While transformative learning also does not ensure that specific kinds of action will be taken, it does involve a deeper form of learning that can forge meaningful pathways between environmental knowledge and sustainable policy innovations. In this respect, transformative ecological knowledge, by establishing more sophisticated levels of understanding, can serve as a precondition in the societal deliberative system as a whole, and thus influence, even help to shape, both the parameters and the outcomes of critical debate that seek to interpret the crisis and its implications for sustainable government. But in the end, it can only be part of a transformational leadership and the politics that go with it, which may only come with crisis. Where should the push for such societal learning come from? Logical contender would be the environmental movement, experimenting with such practices in civil society as in the past, with assistance from people inside the university, like us. While we wait for a political window of opportunity to open, we can, in the meantime, labor to innovate the methods and practices of transformative environmental learning. This is not a promising outlook, but I think it's one that we need to face up to, where we stand in this struggle. My time's up, but if I could say more, I would say something about where such learning might take place and the kind of background and skills that the practitioner of transformative learning requires. If I have 2 minutes, the obvious candidate is the public university. If sustainable development is the challenge of this century, what could be more important for the citadel of learning than to become the center of public ecological enlightenment? In a time when the university is in trouble on all kinds of fronts, people question its diploma mill orientation and so forth. Toward this end, I'd argue that a responsible university should offer deliberative spaces for members of the community to explore environmental citizenship. In line with Dewey-like inspired educational experiments, it should be a transformational extension of what our deans like to call, speak of as an institutional innovation, service learning. We also propose that special activities be used to engage in deliberative research about sustainability education and citizen learning and by the relevant faculty. Let me just skip to the end and conclude by saying that toward this end, we need to knock down the cognitive wall between ourselves and ordinary citizens, deflate the arrogance of environmental expertise, and become ourselves one of the citizens who only happen to possess various kinds of specialized knowledge that might be relevant to the reflexive deliberation of the issues at hand. Here's something learning. So I finished.